All right, we are in like the last four lectures going on here. So this week we're gonna go back to a almost a previous theme, right? The last 2 weeks of the course of this course, this week and next week, will be spent mostly catching up with the last 50 years, approximately post 1960s, which is where we left our discussion of fantasy and neo-medievalism back all the way in February, which seems like almost a year ago now. This week, I want to talk about popular medievalism, such as it is. And next week, I'm going to talk about quote-unquote academic interactions with the discourse, which primarily means, right, Twitter or something. I talked a little bit about some of what I'm going to discuss today and next week in lectures 4 and 5. Here I want to look more broadly at medievalism and not just mainly at like bad bits of medievalism and stuff like that. This particular lecture will talk about popular medievalism from circa 1950 to about 2000, and the next lecture, Wednesday's lecture, will be on medievalism, popular medievalism, 2000 in the year 2002 today. So with that kind of setting things up, in any case, we've talked a lot about, over the past couple of weeks, about specific realities and memories of those realities of crusade and medieval religiosity. And in previous lectures, I've framed the First World War as a particular breaking point between the medieval and the modern, at least in the American and Western European spheres of thinking about time. These two lectures are framed around a smaller shift, but I think still a real shift, which occurred circa 2000, but with the caveat that this is kind of my working hypothesis. We're a little bit too close to events, perhaps, to have a good perspective, or, I don't know, maybe I can't see the full scope of the issue. So if you are looking at the same sort of set of information that I am, and you come up with a different conclusion, that would be really interesting to hear about and discuss, particularly in section. But this shift that I want to talk about is really, in a great deal, responsible for where we are now with the medieval as a front in the culture wars, with this whole obsession with the alt-right and everything else like that. And I want to talk about that, but to get there, we have to first, as always, get our background down. So, where we left off back again in February, before we went into our little excursus into the Crusades and then medieval religion, as fun as those were, where we last left off was with World War I as a moment which ruptures the medieval from the present and consigns it to history. From this rupture during World War I, we have two resulting branches for the idea of the Middle Ages. The first is what we have been calling New Medievalism. That is the academic study of the medieval past, which insists on a strict positivism and separation of academic study from contemporary concerns. We also have what we have been calling, again, neo-medievalism. That is the relocation of lived, quote-unquote, or quote-unquote, continuous medievalism into the realm of fantasy. Neo-medievalism is, of course, aware that its rules are made up and that they are, but nevertheless claims that these rules are true. Okay, so far so good. Oh, before I get too far into this, I totally forgot. I put a slide in here to remind me, and I totally forgot. This Friday, I sent out an email announcement about this. I'm lucky enough to be getting my vaccine on Thursday. Vaccines, particularly like flu vaccines, usually hit me pretty hard, which means that I am not sure if I'm going to feel up to section on Friday. If I do not, we do not have section scheduled for the last week of class next week, so I will just simply delay it until then. I will send out an email as soon as I feel confident that decision will be made one way or the other. Check your email boxes Friday morning. All dates for submissions for the week's comments on the week's readings remain the same. Okay, cool. Sorry. So we were so far so good. World War One, New Medievalism, Neo-Medievalism. Okay. So in 1937, Tolkien publishes The Hobbit, a book which has since sold over 100 million copies, one of the top 3 best-selling books of all time. And Tolkien's work, as we have discussed, is heavily neo-medievalist, which is to say, it is clearly fantasy, it is unapologetically fantasy, but it is also somehow real. In the words of C.S. Lewis, who his contemporary, his friend, Tolkien's friend C.S. Lewis, who's conveniently writing a book review for him, as one's friends do for you, he says, Tolkien has studied trolls and dragons and describes them with fidelity, as if trolls and dragons were real. Right? The publication of The Lord of the Rings in 1954 and 1955 changes the memory of The Hobbit a little bit. People start to see it as a lesser work, as an earlier work, as something that was less complex and more childish. Sort of an inelegant or tonally dissonant first attempt. And in this way, it's actually grouped more with C.S. Lewis's works, stuff like the Chronicles of Narnia, which are published between 1950 and 1956. But both Lord of the Rings, The Hobbit, and The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe, and the Chronicles of Narnia more generally, are on the surface fairly similar. That is, they are all invested in introducing a feigned or alternate history in the same mode in a world that would be inspired, let's say, by the works of someone like Walter Scott. The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe, of course, is pairing, or for those who haven't read it, I guess, is pairing this sort of fantasy medievalism with the Blitz, with the bombings of the German bombings of London. And in the same sort of way, a lot of people read the Lord of the Rings as being talking about the Second World War, specifically with the One Ring, the ring that the main characters must destroy, the Ring of Sauron, standing in as a metaphor for the atomic bomb or the nuclear annihilation. Tolkien, it's worth saying, vehemently denies this. He said if it was indeed meant to be an analogy to the One Ring was meant to be an analogy to atomic weaponry, they would have used it and not tried to destroy it, which is a particularly pessimistic view of human history. But in both of these, in both The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe, and in this reading of Tolkien, as much as Tolkien wants to deny it, if someone wants to read an author in a certain way, that reading is certainly valid, shows a use of neo-medievalism as a coping mechanism or metaphor for the mass death that the Second World War showed was possible. Particularly not only in things like the atomic bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki, but in the bombings of London, the Blitz of London, and even things like the firebombing of Dresden, which was one of the worst humanitarian catastrophes of the war. And this sort of fear, these works embody the fear of global annihilation that came along with the Second World War and the resulting technologies. We have already read bits and pieces of the Canticle for Leibowitz, which is published in 1959, which is explicitly about using medievalism to discuss the possibilities of nuclear holocaust. There is also what is much more typical text or movie to talk about in medieval classes. I don't know a medieval professor who doesn't try to show this movie at some point or other. But Ingmar Bergman's The Seventh Seal, which is to say the movie is titled after the final seal the angel breaks in the Apocalypse of John to begin the apocalypse, which is filmed and released in 1957. The Seventh Seal, for those of you who don't want to sit through 3.5 hours of black and white Swedish film, uses the Black Death, that is the decimation of Europe's population to the disease Yersinia pestis in 1348 through 1351, where Europe lost approximately half of its population, uses this metaphor as a metaphor for nuclear holocaust. And here you see the two main characters here. Death, simply, is on the left, with our unnamed crusading knight on the right. Northern Crusader. This is sort of returning to Sweden. It's also the first time I've seen screen time for a bad priest. And the Black Death is very clearly in Bergman's filming a metaphor for both the fear of nuclear annihilation and the actuality of it occurring. It does have other things in it that kind of show its investment in contemporary stories. Again, it's the first screen time for like a bad priest. The theologian who convinced the main character to go on crusade to the Holy Land for 10 years he comes back and finds him to be a thief and a rapist, or attempted rapist at least. And this is also one of the first pieces that invests very heavily in a knight who is disillusioned with crusade. And this is very interesting if we consider that World War II, by this point in time, as we have previously discussed, is being called the Last Crusade. And although Sweden, again, where this film is from and where Bergman was living, was theoretically neutral in the Second World War, it maintained that neutrality by acceding to German/Nazi requests almost whenever they were asked, and aligning itself with Nazi interests. And there was many Swedish citizens decided to go off and fight for the German army, for the Wehrmacht. And so this creates this very interesting dichotomy with this jaded knight returning from this crusade that he shouldn't have gone on, that was preached to him by a corrupt theologian, which is slight little metaphor there for Nazis, right? Is that the Crusaders are Nazis and the Allies in the Second World War, the U.S., Britain, and Russia, are basically Muslims, which is an interesting meta-commentary that I don't want to get too far into. There are also two other films that from this period that are, again, these are all Academy Award-winning films and things like that, very well known, that are of note. And I think these two films share with The Seventh Seal a common theme. The first of these films is Becket, which is about Thomas Becket, the martyred Archbishop of Canterbury, theoretically martyred at the command of King Henry II of England. This film was released in 1964 and based on a 1959 play. And the other one I have mentioned before is one of my all-time favorites, The Lion in Winter, which is released in 1968 and based on a 1966 play. Both of these films happen to star Peter O'Toole, and both are remarkable for acknowledging and exploring homosexual relationships. They say Becket and Henry II had there's certainly some homosexual tension, and Richard I and Philip Augustus in Lion in Winter it makes an explicit homosexual relationship between the two, although Philip, the devious and perfidious Frenchman that he was only pretending to be gay to upset and get one over on Richard, which both of these movies, Lion in Winter and Becket, are because they were plays, really, I think, focused on character relationships and not broader events. in a way, all three plays, all three pieces, with these two plus the Seventh Seal, are very new medievalists. They're even the depiction of Richard the First as gay was a scholarly idea at the time, and there was an interest in fidelity to source material. The source material that they were using wasn't always correct, particularly for Becket. There's some basic mistakes, which makes things like Becket to be a Saxon when he is in fact a Norman. Minor details, but which was true in the source material the playwright wrote. But even with this, so all three of these films try for high fidelity to a real medieval past. They, at least The Lion in Winter and Becket, all depict real people and real events. Although Becket, the events are much more clear. Lion in Winter is mostly a bunch of real people being put together and then imagining what happened when they all went together. The Seventh Seal tries very much to get the arms and armor and behaviors and appearance and sensory experience of the Middle Ages to what that director thought was correct. But there are also social commentary inherent in this. Of course, Seventh Seal, quite clearly, with nuclear holocaust, but also, the kind of touching on homosexuality in the early 1960s in Britain is very, very interesting when you consider things like, Alan Turing, the very famous computer scientist, or early computer scientist, pre-computer scientist, a man who helped break German codes during the Second World War. Basically, he was father of modern computing, chemically castrated because he was found to be gay, and by the British government, and committed suicide, it seems, in 1954. And this was a fairly popular story. And so it's interesting to me that the popular film depictions of the Middle Ages from this 1950s, 1960s go for historicity and metaphor. Right? They try to depict the medieval as true as they think they can, and they go for a subtext which ties it to contemporary events. And this is interesting because the 1950s and the early 1960s are often described by scholars today as quote unquote a period of quote unquote consensus politics, which are defined primarily by a heavy trust in expertise. Of course, in retrospect, this sort of consensus politics is really the suppression of other politics, non-white male politics, non-straight white cis male politics. But this sort of social commentary that we see in these films seems to be very in line with that description of the 1950s and 60s, which is to say that expertise in accuracy or perceived accuracy of what the Middle Ages were was highly valued. Right? And that even in a neo-medievalist framework, anything that was social commentary needed to not be very noticeable. And of course, 1960s, this consensus liberates / fragments, depends on which side of that debate you're on. And in the 1970s, we see more and more pure fantasy or pulp fantasy. Ursula K. Le Guin, of course, writes Earthsea and publishes in 1968. There's this series, which I had forgotten about last time we talked. I kind of should have assigned something to it. Elric of Melnibone, is I think how you say it, which is a series of kind of pulp fictions published by Michael Moorcock from 1961 through 2010, I think was the last volume in this series. This cover art is very interesting for a lot of reasons. There's a lot of gender and sexuality stuff going on here. I would also kind of add to this list, to Le Guin and Moorcock, I would add Brian Jacques' Redwall series, which is published in 1968 and through 2011, but which, if you haven't encountered, is about medieval mice and otters and badgers and things like that, doing medievally monkish things, well, and going off and fighting battles and stuff like that. It was one of the books I read when I was growing up. But I think the most important neo-medievalist property, as we now use the word, that came from this period is probably the role-playing game Dungeons and Dragons, which came out first in 1974. D&D, in its particularly in its most original version, in this first edition, drew incredibly heavily on Lord of the Rings with its orcs and wizards. It first used to have hobbits and ents, but then changed it to halflings and treants after they were threatened with a lawsuit by the Tolkien estate. Tolkien died the year before this was published, actually, 1973. But really, it's of note that anytime you think elves look like Legolas, if you think elf and you think Legolas and you don't think Keebler, that's Tolkien's influence. There's, in fact, numerous angry, slightly humorous letters from Tolkien to his editors over well-meaning corrections of elves to elfs or elvish to elfish. He wanted elves, right? And same thing with dwarves to dwarfs. That one of these things, the thing his editors were correcting him to were the cutesy versions, and things he was correcting were the kind of strange and weird and freaky versions from Norse mythology. Anyway, Dungeons and Dragons deserves special mention as an expression of neo-medievalism, because it's literally a fantasy with rules. Like, they came in a book. Here, this is the book. This is the book of rules. One of the 3 books of rules, right? Putting myself on the table there. Right? It is almost the ultimate expression of neo-medievalism. But also, for the first time, it allowed fantasy as a form of self-exploration. And because Tolkien and Moorcock and Le Guin and C.S. Lewis all offer a very fixed perspective on who is the reader and who can view a neo-medievalist work, or through whose eyes a neo-medievalist work is viewed, which is white and male. And that's true. The whiteness part is not true for Le Guin, but the maleness part still is, right? And even if we want to make some interesting observations as to gender on this cover here, it's still, again, a white male protagonist. And as we can see in Dungeons & Dragons, they assumed, in fact, a normative white male protagonist. But you can, with Dungeons & Dragons, does not have any rules about what you are allowed to play. It is, in fact, entirely open-ended. So you can experiment with morality, you can experiment with gender, you can experiment with sexuality, and it's a safe place to do so because it's inherently not real. Personal story, I went to high school in 2000 to 2004, and I am not shocked at all by the fact that a lot of my friends who later came out as GLBTQ asterisk, because this was a period of time where people were still very, very, very much in the closet until they got out of their parents' house at least. These people were the ones who played non-obvious, who were the ones who did not play obvious self-insert characters. That is to say, I played a male warrior because I was incredibly uncreative, and also a little bit, uptight. And my friends would, some of my male friends would explore female characters. Some of my apparently straight friends would have their characters form gay relationships. Not a one-to-one relationship there, but interesting nevertheless. And we know that this was Dungeons and Dragons was indeed a liberating space because of the moral panic that followed its release. Here we have I love these titles. Dungeons and Dragons, just harmless fun or sorcery? Evangelists see the game as a front for demon worship because there's a lot of pearl clutching that followed the release of Dungeons and Dragons, particularly from evangelical Christian groups in the United States. D&D, in their minds, caused devil worship, witchcraft, murder, and had naked breasts in some of the illustrations in the manuals. This is just free advertising, guys, right? You go to like 12-year-old kids and go, there's devil worship, witchcraft, murder, and breasts, and kids are like, yes, give me that book, please. No, I don't want to see it. Anyway, and like the similar panics over things like video games, violence in video games following, say, the Columbine massacre in 1999, gun violence in schools, there's allegations that these sorts of fantasies caused psychotic breaks. These fantasies got movies made about them. The horrible movie Mazes and Monsters from 1982, starring none other than Tom Hanks, which I am sure is a screen credit he is no longer interested in. And there's actually there's actually a word in Japanese for this. It's called chunibyo. I can't speak Japanese, but it translates to 8th grader syndrome, where teens or tweens in Japan basically make themselves into like absurd manga protagonists. I am Dark Lord, blah 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 blah. Apparently that really happens. I think it happens more in as with this kind of fear over Dungeons and Dragons. It happens more in the imagination of adults than it does in kids' reality. But yeah, so this sort of idea that this fantasy would suck you in and change your reality was deeply felt in certain sections of the community. D&D backlash, because D&D backlash is also evident in these in something called Chick. There's a preacher whose last name was Chick, and he published these extensive sets of comics. I think there's over 300 of them now, called Chick Tracts. This group is considered by the Southern Poverty Law Center to be a hate group, by the way. These tracts are evangelical, moralizing, anti-Catholic, anti-evolution, have a lot of overlap in terms of both readership and ideology with the Ku Klux Klan, and do things like this. Which spell did you cast, Debbie? I used the mind bondage spell on my father. He was trying to stop me from playing D&D. With, what is her face? What's going on with her face? I don't even know. By the time I started playing, these were jokes. In the early 1980s, these were as serious as, for my generation, the ideas that people might ban violent video games was, which is quite serious. Like as a kid, I remember being very concerned about that. But the popularity in D&D, as much as it caused a reaction from, as a place to explore oneself through one's place in the world through neo-medievalism, coincides with other uses of the medieval that we have already seen to explore identity. Alana, for example, which we have read, was published in 1980. Le Guin publishes Tehanu, which is her first book with a female protagonist. We read a little bit about that in the introduction we read in 1990. Redwall, also again brings mice and stuff like that, was an interesting. Although the relationships were all heteronormative, it's an interesting play on different species commingling and things like that. because you have mice and otters and field mice and different whatever. Hedgehogs. Rats are bad, by the way. Anyway, but you also have, from D&D comes the Renaissance Fair. And the Renaissance Fair is a strange beast, which I could probably denote an entire... I would love to go on a field trip. These are all pictures from King Richard's Fair, which is in kind of southern Massachusetts, southeastern Massachusetts. I would love to have been able to do like a field trip if it was contemporaneous with at all with this class. But alas, if I was able to teach this class in the summer, we could go to King Richard's Fair, and it would be great. But King Richard's Fair has nothing like there's no pretense of authenticity. In contrast to something like the 1836 Elgin tournament, right, the one that was trying to recreate the tournament from Ivanhoe, right, where they spent their time meticulously reading the text of Ivanhoe and being like, okay, so the drapery has to look like this, and this person has to be wearing these two colors with this embroidery down the whatever. The Renaissance Fair is just kind of blah, do something that's kind of not normal, right? This woman in the top right's steampunk, not medieval. There's jousts of a sort. They're a lot of fun. They never really hit each other, so what? There's the bad knight that you have to root against, and everyone, the bad knight kills one of the good knights, and then the other two knights gang up on him, and there's a king and a queen, theoretically, doing something. Like the fans here, and the girls with the fans. There's no actual medieval reality to any of this, but it's fun. And it's a way for people to dress up, to cosplay, before cosplaying and conventions of that sort were a thing. And, again, explore identities for themselves in costume, to take on a new persona. There was also, in 1990, also saw the founding of Wizards of the Coast, which is a company behind Magic the Gathering. Wizards of the Coast, the name there comes from the founders' Dungeons and Dragons campaign, just so you know. They are also, Wizards of the Coast are now the ones who, yeah, you can see kind of right there, they're now the ones who publish the Dungeons and Dragons books. They bought them in 1997? It doesn't matter. It super doesn't matter. Anyway, Magic the Gathering comes out in 1993. And in Magic, this collectible card game, one of the first, you play as a quote-unquote planeswalker, a sort of mage or something, casting spells, which are your cards. They were accompanied by a whole bunch of pulp novels, mass-produced kind of cheap ghost-written novels, which I definitely did not read when I was a young teenager. Nope. Did not read those. The other thing I would mention from this first period was this movie, Excalibur, which is a weird, 1981, it is a weird, hot mess of a thing retelling the legend of King Arthur, the Mort d'Arthur, the death of Arthur, the Mallory's story of the death of King Arthur, the life and death of King Arthur. This, by the way, is one of Zack Snyder's favorite movies. And he's the one who wants to do the true, quote-unquote, image of an Arthurian legend, which article on which you will be reading for class on Friday. I would also note that the period 1997 saw the release of the game Ultima Online. 1999 saw the release of the game EverQuest, two computer games which are massively multiplayer online role-playing games, which are essentially computerized versions of a sort of Dungeons and Dragons. But altogether, this sort of medievalism, this sort of neo-medievalism that was being used to explore identity was niche. It never saw the sort of heights either in things like Academy Award nominations or plays or valence in the popular culture that things like The Lion in Winter, Beckett, The Seventh Seal, things from the consensus era of American politics did, the 1950s and 1960s. People who played D&D or Magic the Gathering were absolutely and undoubtedly nerds. Like, not even cool nerds. Well, cool nerds didn't exist yet, by the way. They were not. There was no TV advertisements for these things. There was no toys. No one had no child actors would. You wouldn't have the Stranger Things where they would play D&D on a television, because that would just invite the evangelicals to come and yell at you, and they were doing that well enough on their own. They didn't need prompting. So this sort of use of the neo-medieval as personal identity, as personal exploration, was really very limited, and not in the kind of back of the head of mainstream culture. And then three things happened. Not just three things, but I'm just going to call them these three things because I think they're three pieces which will stand in for broader cultural shifts. The first is the publishing of Harry Potter and the Philosopher's or Sorcerer's Stone in 1997. The first release of the movie of Lord of the Rings in 2001. And then the terrorist attacks on the World Trade Center of September 11th, 2001, of which we have talked a little bit in respect to the Crusades. These three events represent a radical shift, I think, in the social valence of neo-medievalism. From this sort of thing that had faded out of popular interest into front and center stage in a lot of ways, and marks its first real entry outside of this sort of D&D and evangelical fight that was in the early 1980s, first real entry of neo-medievalism into what we would now call the culture wars. And to that, I will talk more in the next lecture. And I will see you guys then.